Hello, my name is Dr. Stewart Desson and I recently completed my PhD dissertation, and in this video I'm going to give you a short overview of the main achievements in the PhD. It's concerned with building an integrative, adaptive and maladaptive Big Five personality model, and in fact it uses inductive, deductive and criterion-centric methods, looking at measuring both poles of each of the Big Five dimensions. So if I was to cut to the chase and tell you, in developing this model, what has been achieved, how has this helped scientific understanding? The first achievement is around reducing evaluative bias within the Big Five, and in so doing actually improving the user validity experience. And I'm using the term user validity as defined by McLeaver, Anderson, Costa and Evers back in 2014. This reduction in evaluative bias also helps us value diversity, value different people's way of being, particularly in the workplace where sometimes one end is valued more than others. So the first achievement of the PhD is around a reduction in evaluative bias in the Big Five. The second achievement concerns measuring personality both adaptively and maladaptively, yet within one model. Typically in other models these things are measured separately with different frameworks, but by looking at the Big Five and looking at how we overplay aspects of the Big Five or overextend, do too much of a good thing, we can look at maladaptive behaviour without the need to pathologize. And in so doing, this research has been able to discover a new blended personality trait previously not measured within the periodic table of personality traits. The third achievement of the PhD is to improve the scientific understanding of performance at work and its relationship with personality. And this has been done by adopting a fidelity approach in terms of the bandwidth fidelity debate. In other words, measuring things in more specific detail by measuring both ends adaptively and maladaptively. So I'm going to be sharing with you why this research is of interest. I have some aims, some research questions to share with you. I'll say more on the highlights of the work, the findings. There are some limitations and there are some key suggestions for further research and of course some key conclusions. Why is this research of interest? Why is it a contribution to science? Well, I'm suggesting that there is a bias in how many personality models actually assess personality. And I'm also suggesting that when we look at dysfunctional behaviours at work, it is interesting to see, can these dysfunctional behaviours be measured without recourse to referring to mental health models? The relationship between personality and performance at work in the light of measuring both ends and in the light of these dysfunctional traits is something that's explored in this research and quantified. The contribution to organisational psychology is key as well, because if we can better understand these relationships, we can enhance interpersonal relationships and help leaders be more effective in their roles. The research is pretty timely because the changing culture, certainly in Europe and in the Americas, means there is more focus than ever on a reduction in bias in the workplace, and there's a need for what's called deep diversity, to value diversity not just in terms of gender and ethnicity, but deep diversity is valuing diversity in terms of different ways of being and different personality traits. Now here's a picture of Jupiter, and going back a number of years, Jupiter was seen through the lens of a static image of Jupiter, but now with greater technology, more fidelity on our cameras, we can see that Jupiter is actually a dynamic. A snapshot's not so helpful, but things are moving. And this is a nice parallel that can be drawn with personality, because just as in the old days, we used to think that personality was more static. You had one and you were stuck with it for life and it changed little. We're now finding, many researchers are finding, that there is a are dynamic and ebbing and flowing, and maybe people change over their life, they change within a day, they change in different contexts. And the research I'll be sharing with you takes into account a number of these dynamic factors. The dissertation had 5 key aims. The first one was to measure both polarities of each Big Five dimension as scalar opposites and independently. And in so doing, explore the concept of evaluative bias. This is something that's been well researched by Backstrom et al. Back in 2014 and earlier, and to look at the impact on user validity. The second aim was to measure the Big Five adaptively and maladaptively within one instrument. So to take a look at these dysfunctional construct that Judge et al. Have looked at, and to look at the dark side traits that Hogan and Hogan have identified in the Hogan dark side, and see, is it possible to measure things as an overplayed version of the Big Five, and how does it relate to Hogan's dark side constructs? The third aim is to establish the usefulness of the proposed model. It's been coined the BF57, BF for Big Five, 57 because there's 57 items in the model. And so in the model that's been created here, can we understand the convergent and divergent validity with other personality models? And can we locate the scales inside this new BF57 model within the periodic table of personality traits as identified by Woods and Anderson back in 2016? The fourth aim is to look at the BF57 model and say, well, what is the criterion validity of this model? How does it correlate with measures of performance at work using rate of feedback, 360s on people's competencies using the Grade 8 model? And finally, the fifth aim is saying, in the light of this, what can we say about the bandwidth fidelity debate? Do we think it's better to measure things at a higher level, or is there benefit in having more detail and lower level traits? So those are the key 5 aims. Now you might ask at a higher level, well, why measure both ends of the Big Five? Well, this is attributed to Bruce Grossman back in 1960, but if you stick your head in the oven and your feet in the freezer, on average you'll be comfortable. Yet averages are not always that useful. So somebody could be, as indeed I do on the NEO, come out pretty much in the mid-range for agreeableness, but actually when I look at the BF57 results, I'm actually highly agreeable and empathetic, but actually I can be quite disagreeable and argumentative. And so instead of just giving me the average, measuring both ends is quite enlightening. It has user validity benefits and it can help reduce evaluative bias. So we want to measure both ends. Now the methodology that's been adopted here, you've heard about the 5 research aims. There are actually 9 research questions, and in the dissertation 42 different hypotheses have actually been tested against the 9 research questions. And as part of the development process, I did deliver a number of talks at different psychology conferences over the last 2 to 3 years. The International Test Commission, the British Psychological Society, the EWOP conference, and others. Well, in terms of some of the key highlights, I'm suggesting there is an evaluative bias present in other models. And actually, it's not just present in other models, it's present in society. So if we look at this attempt at humour, an extrovert is someone energised by interacting with others, and an introvert is somebody who runs away from extroverts. And there's an attempt at humour here. And you could argue that it may be favouring extroversion. There could be a subtle bias in this attempt at humour. And although that's quite possible and understandable in different cultures, and other cultures could swing the other way, we don't want such biases present in our psychometric measurement. So if I'm suggesting we have this bias in psychometrics, well, why do we? Well, one reason why we may have evaluative bias in models, or a reason that exacerbates evaluative bias, is the use of factor analysis in selecting items. This is a quote from Peterson et al. When an evaluatively unbalanced set of descriptors, such as the big five adjectival markers, as created by Goldberg in 92, when it's subjected to a simple structure rotation algorithm, and the resulting factors almost invariably end up contrasting positive and negative descriptors. That's what was found in this research back in 2014. This is what it practically looks like. So here's an example from Goldberg's model, the trait descriptive adjectives. Goldberg identified the best 100 adjectives in the English language to describe the big five, and here are the 10 adjectives that describe extroversion. Unrestrained, energetic, active, daring, vigorous, bold, verbal, assertive and talkative. All sounds good. We get a sense that this is generally sounds like socially desirable adjectives. And here's introversion. Unexcitable, inhibited, untalkative, timid, withdrawn, reserved, bashful, shy and quiet. You can get a sense here these are slightly less desirable adjectives, and if someone is more introverted, is this how they'd like to describe themselves? Maybe not. However, these are the adjectives that give a really good factor analysis, and they're good for creating a measure of the big five. Yet there's an evaluative bias there. Peabody, back in 1967, has identified this. So it's not a completely new issue, but it's an issue that, although reported on by Costa McCree and Hogan and others, has not been picked up on in terms of the practical application of big five models in organisation. Yet people such as Backstrom et al. Have identified this as a significant issue. Well, what are the issues? Well, it can have a negative impact on user validity. That can include the experience filling in a questionnaire, reading a report, interpreting it, and so on. If my introversion has not been described in such a positive way as extroversion, and maybe if I'm low on conscientiousness, and that's typically not described as well as positive as conscientiousness, maybe if I'm a little bit neurotic and not so emotionally stable, and that's often not described so well, the picture that's painted of me will be less appealing and feel more negative. It can also have an impact on construct validity, because arguably if we're measuring extroversion very positively and introversion less so, are we really measuring the full construct of introversion extroversion? Arguably not. So a couple of questions this poses really is, has the construct been measured in a comprehensive and non-biased way? And how do users feel about reading aspects of their personality if there is a degree of bias, or it could be unbalanced in how it's reported back? Peabody's method suggested measuring both ends of a scale in a positive and a negative form as one way of mitigating evaluative bias, and that's the approach that's been adopted in this research. So if we have a look here, here's the big five with the OCEAN acronym. Typically, when a big five model is created, we measure the positive end of the polarity strongly: openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, agreeableness, and maybe we measure more on neuroticism, which would be the negative aspect in terms of the social desirability. What we're doing in this research following Peabody's method is to also measure the opposite. So instead of just measuring openness, we measure being pragmatic. Instead of being just conscientious, we also measure in a positive way being flexible, seizing the moment, being emergent. Instead of measuring extroversion largely positively, we also measure introversion in terms of listening first, not giving too much away, containing our emotions. Then there's being agreeable versus the opposite. Instead of saying disagreeable, well, let's be direct to the point. And of course, there's neuroticism, which is balanced by emotional stability. We can measure these things adaptively, and we can also, using the Peabody approach of measuring positive and negative, measure them maladaptively. So in this research, the first four factors have been measured adaptively and maladaptively. In this particular research, Neuroticism was measured purely maladaptively, and emotional stability measured adaptively. What does it look like in practical terms? Let me give you some items. Here's an extroverted item. I make new friends easily. And here's an introverted item. Sometimes I listen too much. I don't give my view. That's typically what you might find as an example in a Big Five questionnaire. But it could well be that the extroversion item is much more adaptive and the introverted item has elements of maladaptive behaviour sort of baked into it. The Peabody method would say, well, let's have an introverted adaptive item, such as I choose my words carefully before I speak, and let's have an extroverted item that is actually a little bit more maladaptive or overplayed. Sometimes I talk too much. And the idea in this method is that the evaluative bias present here will even itself out by measuring both ends adaptively and maladaptively. This is a little bit akin to looking at 4 points on a compass. Instead of just looking at north and pointing in one direction, which will be like measuring extroversion, we want to measure both adaptively and maladaptively. And if we do this and aggregate it, we can reduce the bias. We can also, from a user validity perspective, start to explore richer interpretations of the data. So if I'm looking at my own results, it's quite helpful not to just know my one score for extroversion, even if it does have less bias in it, but also to see, well, actually that's also my introversion score. Maybe, you know, my head in the oven, feet in the freezer analogy plays out here. Some people could be quite extroverted and introverted, but maybe they're more adaptive in their extroversion and maladaptive in their introversion, or maybe the other way around. This all improves the user validity through a more nuanced understanding of the data. So in the dissertation, a lot of statistics were produced on reliability and validity. So we've got reasonably good levels of Cronbach alpha, reasonably good test-retest statistics, and things that were looked at included construct validity, convergent and divergent validity, sort of contrasting with Hogan, the IPIP Neo, the trait descriptive adjectives and more. Criterion validity was measured with raters giving feedback on people in terms of their performance at work. Some consensual validity, so if I assess my personality with the BF57, what do other people think about my personality? Have we improved the user validity? Have we decreased evaluative bias? These are all things that have been examined and measured. What I'd like to share with you now is a confirmatory factor analysis. So the idea that the Big Five comes through as a purely independent set of 5 factors that are not correlated has been firmly rejected through a confirmatory factor analysis. And here, in fact, is the factor analysis that is the most accurate model based on the 2,500 plus participants that supported this research. The 5-factor model does shine through. The Big Five is clearly evident, and the 18 scales in this model are very much there, measuring both ends, adaptively, maladaptively across the first 4 factors, but not for the emotional stability and neuroticism. And you can see many cross correlations. Here's the data displayed in a tabular form, and in the Ph.D. the factors were identified, and what they actually measured was hypothesized, as well as exploring the links between them. This can be taken further if we look at a periodic table and we create circumplexes contrasting 2 of the Big Five factors to look at the blends in between. So here is the periodic table as advocated by Woods and Anderson, and the circumplex on the left is looking at agreeableness versus openness, and we can have high agreeableness pure, or agreeableness high and openness high, or the other way around, openness first high then agreeableness, and so on. And this points to different cells within the table. So the Woods and Anderson method for taking the scales measured in the Big Five and seeing where they'd fit in the periodic table has been applied in the Ph.D. So the 18 scales in the BF57 have been located across this periodic table. All of the 18 scales were in the place that we would expect in terms of the big five. What's interesting, of course, is the secondary factor that defines the periodic table when we're looking at blended factors. And one interesting result was that the sort of positive pole of conscientiousness measured in a maladaptive form seemed to be, according to Woods and Anderson, not measured in any of the 10 instruments that they looked at, some of the top 10 research instruments used around the world. Yet the BF57 was picking up on measuring this particular cell in the periodic table. So for anyone interested in that particular combination of being highly conscientious but maybe in a maladaptive form, the BF57 is offering an interesting measurement of that particular cell in the periodic table. Another piece of validity that was analysed in the PhD was criterion validity. And to do this, 14 point-to-point hypotheses were made about how the 18 BF57 scales would correlate with the Great 8. So the Great 8 is a competency model looking at management skills that was identified by Professor Bartram and Dr. Kurz through a number of papers some 15 years ago. So in this matrix here on the vertical are the 18 scales of the BF57, and on the horizontal are the Great 8. On the far right is the sum of the Great 8 to give a measure of overall performance. And in this particular sample, 254 people received feedback from either peers, or if they had a boss, maybe their boss or staff. The feedback was average, so it was one data point for each individual that received feedback. So these 254 individuals with feedback measured against the 8 items of the Great 8, that was correlated with their self-analysis of the BF57. And here we can see the correlation matrix. Hypotheses were made in advance as to what the point-to-point relationships would be, and that was based on a literature review, including Bartram's 2005 paper, in which he identified many of the drivers of performance at work in terms of the Big Five. So if we wean this down, we find that 12 of the 14 hypotheses were actually supported in this correlation matrix, and this is highlighted here. Some of the ones that were interesting were the ones that were not supported. So the competency of analysing situations, it was hypothesized that high openness would be helpful here, and that didn't seem to come through in the data, although maybe unexpectedly, or not hypothesized, but maybe with hindsight makes sense. Being disagreeable or quite direct and logical turned out to be quite helpful in analysing situations. Equally, controlling resources, which according to the theory we would expect to correlate more with extroversion, in fact had more of a negative correlation with being neurotic, for example. And being overly agreeable got in the way of controlling resources. Some of the hypotheses that worked well were things like creating concepts did indeed link with openness, relating to people was in fact quite nicely linked to extroversion, respecting people did indeed fit well with agreeableness, adapting to demands as we expected would fit with being emotionally stable and not being neurotic. Delivering results, yes, it did come in and have a link to conscientiousness, so that was helpful there, and driving performance too. And if we look at the sum overall, there was a links between conscientiousness and overall performance and extroversion and being emotionally stable or not neurotic. So some interesting and supportive findings in terms of the hypotheses tests. There were some further hypotheses in the PhD that looked at reducing evaluative bias. Now, evaluative bias was measured by asking individuals to assess the items in the trait descriptive adjectives, the IPIP-NEO, and in the BF57, but instead of assessing their own level of a particular trait, what they were asked to assess was how desirable do they think that is in their workplace, in the culture, in the world. Do they think that that's a good thing? And then measuring the different, in the case of the TDA, how the adjectives played out in terms of social desirability. And the hypotheses here, there were 4 hypotheses, which boiled down to we were expecting a reduction in evaluative bias across openness, conscientiousness, extroversion, and agreeableness. We weren't expecting it with neuroticism and emotional stability, because that, of course, was not measured adaptively and maladaptively in the BF57. That's why there's 18 scales rather than 20. And indeed, all 4 of these hypotheses were supported. There was good evidence that the BF57 has reduced evaluative bias compared to the trait descriptive adjectives and compared to the IPIP-NEO. So if I just flick through now the 9 research questions and give you a high-level take on the answers to them. Now, is the proposed BF57 model of personality, is it compatible with the Big 5 structure? In other words, do we still have the Big 5 structure? Well, according to our confirmatory factor analysis, indeed, we do still have the Big 5 when we measure things at both ends, adaptively and maladaptively. And where do these BF57 scales fit in the periodic table that Woods and Anderson identified? That has been identified. Things fit exactly where we may have expected, and we have discovered a new blended factor, conscientiousness, in a maladaptive form. The third research question was around the adaptive scales. Do the adaptive scales in the BF57 correlate more highly with than the maladaptive scales with other bright side measures from the Hogan and from the IPIP-NEO and so on? And as a general rule, most of the hypotheses were supported around that. And in fact, the other way around, the maladaptive scales measured in the BF57, we'd expect them to correlate more highly with the Hogan dark side than the adaptive traits would. The picture was somewhat mixed here. So in terms of this research question, that there was evidence that the maladaptive traits that were linked to introversion, for example, did indeed correlate more with the Hogan dark side, but some of the ones that were linked to extroversion and openness, not so. It seemed there was not much in it between the adaptive and maladaptive in the BF57 and how it correlated with the dark side. So is there evidence to suggest that the BF57 maladaptive is in fact an overplayed overextension of the Big 5? It's the extreme ends of the Big 5. We think we have found good evidence here to support that in terms of exploring the research question. And the a priori hypotheses around the point-to-point link between personality and competence when we measure both ends, has this stacked up? A large number of the hypotheses indeed have, and that's been fully explored. Do we have differential patterns in criterion validity between adaptive and maladaptive? This has been explored in depth and is particularly interesting. So what it's really saying is we can't just assume that introversion, extroversion is one scale. If we do break it down into adaptive, maladaptive, and measure things at both ends, we often do get sort of differential correlations with different competencies. So sometimes it's being highly extroverted is in a positive way drives your performance. For other competencies, that doesn't really matter, but avoiding maladaptive introversion is more critical, and so on. So the differential validities have been fully explored. And the 8th research question was looking at the BF57 in terms of bandwidth and fidelity. So here the model was used to explore, if we do just measure the Big 5 at the high level and correlate that with performance, how does that compare with a model using all 18 of the scales in the BF57? And the research here did suggest that the fidelity approach does yield a better explanation of the data, and we do explain more of the variance. So we're really supporting the fidelity side of the bandwidth fidelity debate, at least for the data we've gathered here in terms of performance at work measured through raters. And the ninth research question, can the BF57 reduce the impact of evaluative bias in the Big Five? The straight answer to that seems to be yes. We've got some good evidence here that that is the case. So I've covered most of the key findings here. I'd like to say a few things about the limitations of this research and the suggestions for further research. So this is what some have called a weird sample, meaning it's largely based on people who are more Western, that the sample has a lot of people from the UK, Canada, the US, educated, industrialized, rich, democratic countries. So we can't generalize this research into maybe Asia or other countries in Africa and so on. In other words, it needs to be replicated in different cultures to see if these relationships still hold true. And we did use 360-degree observations or rate of feedback for the criterion measure. Now, while that is I do believe that's a very good way of measuring performance at work. It has a degree of objectivity about it. But nevertheless, it is just one way of measuring it, and that is a limitation of this research. There could be other criterion measures from the workplace that this research could be replicated with, including maybe staff engagement data and so on. Can we assume a causal inference? We have successfully correlated personality with performance at work. The hypotheses, many of them do stack up. However, we can't assume that one drives the other. That's not been examined in this research. There are some things that merit further investigation. So the confirmatory factor analysis, although a really good fit was achieved with a pretty significant sample size, of course it needs to be replicated on new samples and again pretty large sample sizes are needed to do that accurately. Could it be that certain maladaptive traits actually are detrimental in many roles to many competencies, but actually in certain contexts could be essential to performance? So exploring that idea could be a great source of future research. The obvious one would be if for example, a soldier is about to go into combat, then high levels of aggressiveness may in fact be appropriate. The opposite as well, can neuroticism be expressed adaptively? In this research, that wasn't explored. Neuroticism was measured maladaptively and emotional stability adaptively, largely because much of the research does point to that being the case. However, it would be very interesting to hypothesize that there can be benefits to neuroticism. For example, in a very high-risk situation, a degree of anxiety could actually be extremely helpful. And equally, could high levels of emotional stability in certain contexts at work start to become maladaptive? If I'm so optimistic, could I become hopelessly unrealistic? Could that have a negative impact on performance? Of course, it likely depends on the role, but if you're in a very structured, planned environment, maybe being too optimistic is not a good thing. This merits further research. The periodic table from Woods and Anderson is quite brilliant, and there's the possibility here, could we create a maladaptive periodic table where we still, and could we do that through measuring both ends, both adaptively and maladaptively? So some sort of enhancement to that table to locate more blended traits using this more finessed and nuanced approach. And could indeed the BF57 be used to dissect and assess the construct validity of other instruments? So by having both ends measured adaptively, maladaptively, that's an interesting take on the Big Five, and it would be helpful to know if other key instruments that are being researched, where they fit against those different polarities. That could be a really good thing to do. So in summary, I've just got 5 key conclusions from the dissertation and the PhD. The first conclusion is that evaluative bias actually is an issue. It's been known about for a while, but I do believe it's increasingly becoming an issue that people want to take note of. Can we address this issue, the second conclusion, by measuring both ends of the Big Five? yes, we can. There's good evidence here that measuring both ends makes a contribution to reducing that evaluative bias, as indeed does the third conclusion around measuring things adaptively and maladaptive. That helps reduce evaluative bias too. And this measurement of the more extreme ends, the too much of a good thing, does help explain enablers and blockers to performance at work, and it does avoid the need to pathologize. It's much easier for people to own up and own the concept that they maybe overplay their extroversion or overplay their directness, rather than it being seen as something quite dysfunctional or maybe even linked to mental health. The fourth conclusion, adding all this together, is that the BF57 is an approach that does reduce evaluative bias compared to other Big Five psychometrics, certainly in this research compared to the TDA and the IPIP-NEO. And this will also enable test users to sort of crack open their Big Five scores to look at both ends, both adaptively and maladaptively, and this brings additional user validity benefits. And finally, the fifth conclusion is that the BF57, it has explored all 18 scales in terms of the periodic table, and some of the less well-researched cells in the periodic table are in the BF57. In particular, conscientiousness in a maladaptive form, that has been located, and that's a very, very interesting result that needs to be replicated and further checked. So I'm hoping you found that overview of my PhD dissertation really helpful. I'm hoping I've highlighted the key achievements and some of the key findings. If you wish to know more, it is my favourite topic for discussing. You're very welcome to see the full dissertation. Happily send that through to you. And if anybody would like a further dialogue around it, I'm more than happy to put on some webinars or have one-to-ones to discuss it. So thank you for listening to me. Thank you for being interested in my PhD dissertation, and take care.